All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Paul Bellinger. I'm going to be talking to you a little bit today about ideology mapping and electronic literature, particularly as it regards my most recent creative endeavor entitled Into the Machine and Interrogative Utopia. Now, Into the Machine is an ideologically driven hypertext narrative that's designed to assist in the traversal of the utopian fantasy as the heart of every ideological position. However, before we get into the machine proper, the first thing I want to do is go through a few of the basic premises the work is based on. To begin with, this work adopts Althusser's definition of ideology as an imaginary representation of individuals to their real conditions of existence. And from this perspective, then, ideology is a profoundly unconscious understanding of the world through which a subject situates him or herself within human society. By this, I mean that the ideological fantasy provides a foundational narrative of how the world is structured, what the best possible world might look like, and who or just what is preventing us from realizing that world. In order then to gain a critical distance from our ideology, I propose that this fantasy is not to be interpreted, only traversed. All we have to do is experience how there is nothing behind it, and how fantasy masks precisely this nothing. Indeed, the evolution of the literary utopia as a manifestation of ideology traces a trajectory of traversal, as in all the way from utopia as symptom or mere wish fulfillment, as can be seen in our constitutive, prescriptive, and regulative utopias, all the way to utopia as a tool of traversal, as we can find in our dystopias and ambiguous utopias, particularly beginning with Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed. In the dystopia, then, traversal occurs when a single ideology is taken to its extreme and is thus destroyed through its inherent and necessary inconsistencies, shortcomings. And then in the ambiguous utopia, multiple ideologies are destroyed, or at least seriously contested in a similar manner. This process, and the emphasis here is on process, views utopia less as an endpoint for human civilization and more as a way of examining the world of the actual through the world of the imagination as we attempt to chart our way to at least a better future. Now, such an understanding can be found in utopian studies, with people like Darko Suvin acknowledging that utopia is an epistemological beast. It is method and not a state. Frederick Jameson makes a similar observation when he notes that utopia can serve the negative purpose of making us more aware of our mental and ideological imprisonments, and therefore the best utopias are those that fail most comprehensively. That is, in his perspective, there is an obligation for utopia to remain an unrealizable fantasy. More than this, I would say it's not just an obligation, but a structural necessity. So while utopia is a means of examining a subject's ideology, and a means that has continually moved us closer and closer to the encouragement of traversal, the literary utopia has yet to realize its full potential in this regard. And so it's here that I claim cyberspace enters the picture. For the cultural artifact is a socially symbolic act, and if everything in the last analysis is political, and utopia itself philosophically analogous to the trace, then a utopian artifact that is able to chart a user's response to the ideologisms embedded within it, and then subsequently use that mapping to direct the narrative. Well, suppose what we'll have is a utopian artifact twice as effective in assisting in the traversal of fantasy. Indeed, it's my contention that because you must choose one cyberspace identity, which will always in a way betray you, that electronic literature is uniquely suited to just this sort of endeavor. Zizek seems to agree, and from the same essay as that last quote here, he observes that cyberspace, with its capacity to externalize our innermost fantasies and all their inconsistencies, opens up to artistic practice a unique possibility to stage, to act out the phantasmatic support of our existence. Far from enslaving us to these fantasies, and thus turning us into desubjectivized blind puppets, it enables us to treat them in a playful way, and thus to adopt towards them a minimum of distance. In short, to achieve what Lacan calls going through or traversing the fantasy. Now that said, Zizek also observes that traversal is not the necessary outcome of our experience of cyberspace. Indeed, I would suggest that traversal is rather the exception than the rule. And the reason that I say this is because the ability to map a user's movements through the web, whether it be as likes or posts or shares or Tinder swipes or IP address information or perhaps the biographical information we so willingly share with third parties today, that it has allowed corporations and governments and even private individuals to create psychological profiles on us. And this is, of course, evident in the targeted marketing and the personalized web searches and new media-based political campaigns that are driving the daddy economy of the modern web. That is, not only do we use the internet to actively seek that which already reaffirms our fantasies as a sort of act of confirmation bias, but we are increasingly only shown that which we already agree with, that which we want to see. And this, in turn, only strengthens the prisons of our ideologies. Into the Machine, then, is an attempt to retool this so that we can actually realize the full potential of utopia and of cyberspace as an aid to traversal. So to accomplish this, there were a number of objectives that I had to meet. First was to establish a map of possible ideological positions. Secondly, enunciate an underlying fantasy for those positions. Thirdly, write a branching narrative that corresponds to this mapping. And then finally, design and code a system capable of charting a reader's movements within the narrative, as well as subsequently responding to the reader's placement on the ideological map. Regarding this mapping, I ultimately settled on what I call the AC scales. And this is a two-dimensional representation of ideology that's reminiscent of the Nolan chart, the Purnell chart, What Gates of Anarchy, an online ideology quiz known as the Political Compass. In short, many different sort of typologies that have already looked at this question. So in this model, the reader's ideological position is then plotted along the axis of authoritarianism and of economics. Regarding the A scale, we have a range from authority to anarchy, and this deals with questions of social organization, including the best way to institute and maintain preferred economic platforms, the preferred degree of social liberties, the sanctity of tradition, and the extent to which fantasy is propagated through force rather than reason or rational self-interest. The economic scale then represents the traditional left-right divide, with communism on one end of the spectrum and capitalism on the other. This axis concerns questions of economic organization and the role of the commune in our socio-political decision-making. With these coordinates set forth, the next thing I did was to provide a corresponding label from sort of traditional political science studies and to develop a fantasy that could drive each of those positions. In short, the capitalist fantasy involves that of the maker and the taker, whereas the communist fantasy involves that of the immoral hoarder. The authoritarian fantasy is largely based on that of the benevolent king and, to some extent, the good old days, whereas the anarchist fantasy is based on a supremely rational or selfless individual. Within the context of Into the Machine, then, the fantasies that I devised are as follows. The state's socialist quadrant tells the story of a general union in opposition to the corporate interests it sees as having deprived its workers of the productivity of their labor. The neoconservatives' storyline follows the efforts of a strong military that's intent on wiping out the threats to the reigning economic and political order. The neoliberal branch deals with an umbrella corporation known as the Board, moving to acquire and develop new resources and technologies, while eliminating the union presence it feels threatens the progress of not just individuals, but the world itself. And then finally, the libertarian socialist striation involves a dispossessed population planning to seize the natural resources that would make their self-sufficiency possible. Having thus settled on the ideological map and an outline of potential fantasies, I needed to develop a narrative structure to house them. So originally this structure was highly rhizomatic, but the storylines were highly intertwined, and each action within the story, so readerly action, would have an immediate narrative impact. Now, this unfortunately presented some difficulties for readers and for writer alike, including things like cognitive overload, getting lost in hyperspace, questions of obsolescence. In short, all the problems that have plagued electronic literature from the beginning. To overcome these, I opted for a more elegant, a more simple solution, and ultimately went with a branching narrative. So in this structure that we have pictured here, the first tier is neutral, and this is so that the reader has a clean slate to to project his or her fantasies onto. And here the main character, Preston James, who is a struggling journalist and an all-around average guy, meets Eliza. And she is the object cause of his desire, both professionally and sexually. And so all of his sort of mediocrity and his struggles begin to change as she brings him not just the possibility of sexual and interpersonal fulfillment, but the story of a suicide murder of a character named Ellis. A character that everyone, it seems, from the government to the dispossessed, is chasing or attempting to use his death to further their ends. Reaching the end of this initialization stage, then Tier 2 bifurcates according to the economic fantasy, and it's in this section that Preston begins the process of building his relationship with Eliza and learning how Ellis actually inspired and in some ways helped institute the thus far mapped economic fantasy. In addition, he begins to understand why Eliza seems so familiar to him, something that was an initial point of attraction for him. However, it's only upon the completion of several of these narrative strands that the reader, him or herself, begins to understand that Eliza is actually Preston's other half in more ways than one. So in the final section, then, the economic fantasy branches off into the authoritarian and anarchist striations. And in this tier, Preston meets one of the four leaders who best represents the qualities and drives of that ideology. In following them, he further witnesses how the very act of striving to realize that fantasy results in catastrophic failure. So then at the end of any of these novella-length branches, what is going to happen is the reader will be redirected back to the next best fitting storyline. And so, for example, if she's an anarcho-communist with stronger communists than anarchist leanings, she'll be redirected then back to the authoritarian communist striation. And then from there to the next best fit, and so on and so forth, until all four fantasies have been examined and dissolved. And it's through this multiplicity of failure, then, that it's hoped that the reader will come to recognize the structure of ideological fantasy and the desires they spawn. So with the ideological and narrative structures set forth, I needed to devise a way to map a user's reactions within the resulting text as a trace of their ideologies. So the way I do this is by presenting 15 to 20 stimuli per chapter, and I do so in situ. So that in the normal course of reading, the reader is actually going to come across a series of highlighted sentences, each of which is going to have an underlying weight on the AC scale. The reader, upon coming to these sentences, is going to be asked to provide a negative or positive affective response, and she can do so by either left or right-clicking the mouse or arrow keys, or by using the on-screen icons. Now, the intensity of these responses will be indicated by duration. So a 0.2 of a second response, for example, could then be multiplied by the underlying base weight of that stimulus, and the result can be added to the user's AC scales, so that we can plot them on our chart. Now, I will note that while the weights are currently set according to sort of my perspective, they are designed to be refined by those who opt in to take a standardized political psychology quiz before reading. And so the way this will happen is we'll take the standardized score and we'll use then their responses in comparison to that score to augment the underlying base rates. All right then, with a bit of the system laid out and an understanding of the function of ideology in this utopian narrative, as well as the fantasies that I'm basing the story on, I want to take you into the machine itself for a quick read. So here we have Into the Machine. Before we begin, a few things I want to just let you know. First of all, the stimuli here are going to appear with greater frequency than they do in the novel itself, and the underlying base weights have been exaggerated so that we are able to see immediate movement on our ideological chart. I will also note that the pictures in the background here are going to change depending on where you are in the story, but those two have been ramped up so as to just give you an idea of how that works. And the pictures change just to make a note to provide a real-life corollary to the science fiction world. So previous utopian attempts in the real world mirroring the utopian attempts in the fantasy world. All right then, and remind you what our map looks like, and just give you a bit of information about this passage coming from the chapter 3 of the authoritarian capitalist striation, and dealing with a similar sort of testing as we're engaged in here. The testing is being undertaken so that Preston can be offered a position either with the corporation known as the board, or with the world's military. And that's going to depend, of course, on whether or not he's gauged to be an anarchist or an authoritarian. Last note, and we'll get going, is that AR here stands for augmented reality. That's the technological advance that has really allowed this world to become what it is, and has allowed Preston to experience this multiplicity of ideological positions. Chapter 3. Preston's head bobbled as the young doctor adjusted the headset's fit. The AR's display ran from one extreme of his peripheral vision all the way to the other, and a series of sensors inside the unit dug into his skull like the fingers of a modern-day phrenologist. "This will be a bit cold," Glitch said, lifting Preston's shirt so that he could attach another array of electrodes. The gelled pad stuck to a few scraggly chest hairs. They pulled when Preston's shirt got caught on the wires. "Now I'm about to show you a series of images and ask a few questions about them," Glitch said, logging into his tablet and dimming the lights. "You can speak freely, answering however you like. There are no right or wrong answers, even silence counts. You ready?" The weight of the headset exaggerated Preston's nod. Glitch tapped run. The augmentation began with Preston standing upon the dais of a flatbed truck. They were parked in the cavernous hall of the dome's loading docks, and he looked up to a woman moving towards him at full speed. Pulling up short, she extended her hand and bent her head. "Thank you, Madam President," she said, her features never quite settling into place. So here at this first stimulus, I could be responding to the idea of a Madam President. I could be responding to the uncanny experience of looking at a human face that never quite gels. Either way, I will have a positive reaction and just do so throughout. "So tell me, what interested you about Mrs. Freakoff's acceptance day photo?" Glitch asked. The AR stuttered slightly as the president reached through Preston's point of view in order to drape the medallion of acceptance around Freakoff's neck. Was it as heavy as this headset, Preston wondered. "She's so confident," he said instead. "I see, and is that confidence something you aspire to?" Preston thought a moment. "Maybe," he said haltingly. "Well, what is it then?" He focused on the family behind her. "What she's achieved, I suppose? So her success." "Her struggle," Preston clarified, gradually submitting to the weight of AR and the hunched text round of stress, polygraph, and perception tests. Struggling at first, he found it increasingly easy to talk to this man. Glitch's voice began to hypnotize. By the 10-minute mark, he wasn't even hearing the questions or seeing the pictures anymore. He merely answered. Glitch helped him recline. Arranging the AR cords over the side of the bed, the techno-psychologist pulled a thin, starched sheet over Preston's chest. He shivered. The lights dimmed further, and a cool electronic voice began a long series of mantras. Wealth evinces righteousness. Peace demands force. Misery seeks equality. Freedom requires servitude. Interspersed between these mantras were images of Preston's host mother, butterfly gardens, and the terracotta fences he tied his boyhood dreams to. It was as if they had a record of every happy thought he'd ever had. But his fears were there too, and one by one his dreams devolved into burst craniums and diseased rats, empty plates and darkened closets. 20 minutes in, and Preston understood why they called it a battery of tests. The sleep portion of the exam began without his even knowing it. Coming to, he stirred beneath the hospital crisp sheets, unsure how long he'd slept, but waking with the bruised mind and invigorated spirit of strenuous mental exercise. The room was again lit with its ambient glow, and despite a dim fog over his thoughts, he felt good. Exceptional, even. Glitch was making notes on his tablet. Preston rubbed the sleep from his eyes. His gums smacked of cottonmouth. "How'd I do?" he asked, rolling onto an elbow, his circulation again mixing the contents of his blood as his heart rate returned to normal. Glitch looked up from his work. "Just as expected," he said, removing his glasses and setting his tablet aside to pour a glass of water from the crystal pitcher. So if we go ahead then and pull our ideological chart back up, we can see that we have been plotted into the anarcho-communist striation. As we're currently reading, however, in the authoritarian capitalist striation, what will happen is at the next chapter break, the reader will be rerouted through the narrative so that she is reading the better fitting storyline, essentially. And then once all four storylines have been read in this way, the reader will hopefully come to understand the structure of their ideological fantasies and the utopian desires that they spawn. So thank you for your time. I look forward to your questions.